today for Broken Budgets after the session explaining the fiscal crisis. I'm Nicole Duper, Communications Manager with the Pew Center on the State. The AP and APME have chosen a particularly critical year to launch its Broken Budget series. 2011 has proven to be the recession's toughest year yet for many states, as they continue to struggle to balance their budgets. A word about our work. The Pew Center on the States is a division of the Pew Charitable Trust that identifies and advances effective solutions to critical issues facing states. We take an in-depth, nonpartisan approach to track and report on what happens across the 50 states and the District of Columbia. When the facts are clear, Pew and our partners advocate for practical reform. We recognize that the national economy won't fully recover until the states do, and we seek to help policymakers identify solutions to put their states back on solid fiscal footing. I encourage you to visit our website, pewcenteronthestates.org, for more information about our work and what we found in your states. Pew has a long history of working with journalists. In fact, we helped create Capitol Beat, which is an association of State House reporters and editors, and we hope this partnership with the AP and APME will build on that history. We have a program today that is aimed at helping you better understand your state's fiscal situation and to identify and tell the most compelling stories possible. First, we'll be joined by Phil Joyce, Professor of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Phil will talk us through the nuts and bolts of state budgeting, including where states get and spend their money, who's who in state budgeting, and where you can find the numbers to feed your stories. Then we'll turn to Pam Praw and Steve Fair, Senior Staff Writers for Stateline, a news service of the Pew Center on the States that delivers daily news and fresh analysis of state policy. Pam and Steve are going to talk about some of their experiences covering state budgets, how to get the numbers you need most, and to put a human face on a compelling fiscal story. And finally, we'll hear from Kil Ha, Director of our state's fiscal health research. He will walk us through some of the trends in state finance that we're following and that may be candidates for stories in your states. And once we finish the prepared remarks, we're happy to take as many questions as possible. To ask a question, you can simply type a question in the chat box on the right-hand corner of your screen. We will take as many questions as possible with the time that we have. We do ask that you identify yourself and your news outlet when you type in your question. And I'll note that we will be happy to send you the slides we use in today's presentations for your reference, along with some other helpful resource sites and documents. And the APME will be posting this webinar on its website, apme.com, for you to refer back to or to pass along to your colleagues. So now I will turn it over to Phil.
Thanks very much, Nicole. My job today is to present a brief overview of state budgeting, and that will include the makeup of state budgets, the process of state budgeting, and some key issues and sources of data. To start out, when we talk about budgets, there really is not only one budget at the state level. There can be multiple budgets, but in particular, there's a distinction between operating budgets and capital budgets. The main distinction between operating and capital budgets has to do with the source of financing, with operating budget revenues coming from taxes and capital budgets coming from borrowing. Within the operating budget, the budget itself is actually a collection of many funds in states. The reason states have funds is because there are legal requirements or legal limitations on how money can be spent. Particular revenue sources can only be spent for particular kinds of expenditure items, for example. When we talk about funds, the most important fund for states is the general fund, and the general fund is financed from general taxes such as, for example, the sales tax and the income tax, and money from the general fund can be used for any legal purpose that the legislature and the governor agree to. There may also be, at the state level, many special revenue funds. The thing that distinguishes a special revenue fund is that it's financed from earmarked revenues, that is, revenues that can only be used for particular purposes. A good example of this, which occurs in virtually every state, is that gasoline tax money can only be used for transportation purposes. So there might be a special revenue fund called the Highway Fund or the Motor Fuel Tax Fund or something like that. In addition to these general funds and special revenue funds, states have what are called proprietary funds. Those are for self-supporting activities from user fees, for example. and fiduciary funds. Fiduciary funds are funds held in trust for other individuals, and the best example of that are pension funds. On the capital side, capital budgets are financed from borrowing. States issue what are called municipal bonds, and those bond proceeds are used to finance capital construction projects. That occasions a separate budget or priority setting process, which is also related to a separate multi-year capital improvement plan that is adopted in most states. And the capital improvement plan usually covers 5 to 7 years, whereas the capital budget will cover only the next year or 2 years in the case of a biennial budgeting state. When we look at the revenue side of the budget, there are really 3 main sources of revenue for states if we look at them on a national basis. And when the information we're presenting here is the aggregate information across the whole country. It will differ in individual states. The biggest single source of revenue for state governments is intergovernmental revenue, and intergovernmental revenue in the case of state governments means money coming from the federal government to state governments. In this particular year, which is fiscal year 2009 that I'm demonstrating here, this also included the economic stimulus money, but routinely it would also include money for the Medicaid program, which is a shared federal-state program, education programs, transportation, and environmental protection, among others. In terms of taxes, the big 2 revenue sources in terms of the taxes that are actually raised by governments are the sales tax and the income tax. The sales tax represents about 1/4 of state revenues, and that itself is divided between the general sales tax and specific sales taxes on things like gasoline, liquor, and cigarettes. The income tax is divided into an individual income tax, which is about 16% of state budgets, and a corporate income tax, which is a tax on corporate profits. Most states, in excess of 40, have both an income tax and a sales tax. There are a few states that only have one or the other, and there's one state, Alaska, that has neither one. New Hampshire almost has neither one, but it does have an income tax on dividends and interest. And then in addition to those 3 sources, there also are user charges that states use, and then miscellaneous other sources of revenue. In terms of the key issues on the revenue side, the big key issue currently is the extent to which revenues are recovering from the recession. State revenues usually grow at least as fast as inflation, if not faster, but between 2008 and 2009, and then again from 2009 to 2010, there actually were nominal revenue declines, meaning that they actually brought in less money in 2009 than 2008, and then less money in 2010 than 2009. That is starting to turn around slowly. One of the big issues, however, is as that is starting to turn around, is the same time that the states are losing the majority of the economic stimulus money that came from the federal government, which makes it more challenging. A second issue is the timing of collections. For the income tax, the second calendar quarter is the most important quarter in terms of collections because it's the quarter in which April 15th or May 1st for some states falls, which is a very important date in terms of income tax revenues. For the sales tax, the 4th quarter is more important because of the holiday shopping season. Another big issue in terms of state revenues is the collection of sales tax on remote sales, and in this case we're really talking mostly at this point about internet sales. More and more sales are being conducted over the internet, and it's very difficult for states to collect those taxes if the seller does not collect them, and the seller is not always required to collect them if there is not an actual physical presence of that business in the state. Many states do revenue updates quarterly or monthly. That's a very good source of information for reporters to be able to track how revenues are doing compared to the initial projections. And after several years of over-forecasting revenues, and this is not intentionally over-forecasting, this is just the effect of the recession, states are beginning to return to a more typical accuracy pattern in terms of forecasting revenues. On the expenditure side, I'm presenting this here both in terms of the general fund and also all state funds. If we look at the general fund, which is the first bar on each of these bar graphs, you can see that almost half of the general fund expenditures go for education, either K-12 education, which is more than a third of state budgets in aggregate, or higher education. The K-12 education funding is almost exclusively money that gets transferred to local governments and then is spent directly by those local governments. In terms of higher education, obviously, this is state universities. The other big general fund dollars go to Medicaid, which is about 16% of the general fund, and corrections, which is about 7%. If you put those four together, then that represents about 80% of all general fund spending. The only other item that's not among those, but which comes out as significant when you look at all funds, is transportation spending, because those funds come typically not from the general fund, but from highway trust funds or road funds. In terms of the key actors of state budgeting, the first set of key actors are the state agencies. Now, the thing to understand about state agencies is state agencies want more money. They don't want more money because they're looking to waste money. They want more money typically because they believe in what they're doing. They run up against, however, the state budget office, which are employees of the governor. And the state budget office is not trying to give state agencies more money. They're trying to constrain budgets, and the reason they're doing that is because there isn't enough money in order for state agencies to have everything that they want. So the first point of conflict, typically in a budget cycle, is a conflict between the state agencies and the state budget office in terms of what's going to be in the governor's budget. On the legislative side, we have legislative committees. This might be one committee that deals with the whole budget, or it might be a number of different committees that are dealing with portions of the budget. There might be committees that deal with the revenue side and other committees that deal with the spending side. It differs from state to state. And then the full legislature obviously has to approve the budget, and then it goes to the governor, the full legislature, meaning in every place but Nebraska, a House and a Senate, both having to approve the budget. The full legislature may be supported by legislative budget office or legislative budget staff. The existence of those and the size of those depends on how big the legislature is and how professional and well-staffed it is. In terms of the timetable for developing the operating budget, most states, and here I mean 46 out of 50, have fiscal years that run from July 1st to June 30th. The exceptions to that are New York, which has a fiscal year that starts on April 1st, Texas on September 1st, and Alabama and Michigan on October 1st. If a state has a fiscal year that runs from 7/1 to 6/30, the agency budget development process is usually occurring between sometime in the summer and September or October. The agency submits its budget request to the budget office. The budget office then reviews it and makes recommendations, and ultimately the result of all of that is the governor's budget, which is submitted to the legislature usually sometime between December and February. Now, from the standpoint of journalists, one thing to understand about this executive process is that it's almost completely invisible to you. That is, it is not occurring out in the open. It's occurring in behind-the-scenes conversations between agencies and the budget office, and then the governor's budget comes out as a sort of fully formed document. Once the governor's budget comes out, obviously we then turn to the relationship between the governor's budget and what the legislature may want to do, and the legislature is reviewing and adopting the budget and maybe making substantial changes or maybe making minor changes to the budget, usually between March and June. Other significant variations among the states, one has to do with the extent to which governors have veto authority. In 44 of the 50 states, governors have the power to line item veto individual items in appropriation bills. That means that instead of only being able to approve the entire bill or veto the entire bill, they can actually cut individual line items out. An even stronger power is something called the reduction veto, which means that they not only have the power to cut the item out, but they also have the power to reduce it. So, for example, if a $100 million appropriation item passed, they could cut it to $50 million. A small number of states, 4, have what's called a mandatory veto power. That's the power to actually change substantive words in legislation. For example, the governor of Wisconsin in the past has been known to do things like cut the word not out of legislative language. When you cut the word not out of a sentence, it tends to change its meaning. The other difference between states is the extent to which they have biennial budgets versus annual budgets. There are 23 states that have a biennial budget process, which means they're only making budget decisions in normal circumstances once every 2 years. Mostly these are smaller states with biennial legislative sessions, but there are some larger states like Virginia, Texas, Ohio that have biennial budget processes. In 49 of the 50 states, this is everyone but Vermont, there is a requirement either in statute or in the Constitution that the budget be balanced. Most people tend to believe that this is the reason that budgets are balanced at the state level, but actually there's a more important reason in my view, which is that the bond rating agencies, which have a significant effect on the bond ratings and therefore the amount that states have to spend in terms of borrowing, pay a lot of attention to whether your budget is balanced or not. Finally, for my piece, just a little bit about sources of data on state budgeting. There are various national organizations that provide very useful reports and data on state budgeting. There's an organization called the National Association of State Budget Officers, which is a membership organization for the budget directors and budget staff. There's the National Conference of State Legislatures, and then, of course, the Pew Center on the States, which has more recently provided a lot of useful information. In terms of the states themselves, the key documents to look at would be the state budgets. Now, what you need to understand is that most of what you're going to see here is the governor's proposed budget. It's a little bit more hit and miss whether the actual adopted budget is easily available. And then there are documents called the Comprehensive Annual Financial Reports and the official statements, which they issue when they issue bonds, and I know Steve's going to talk about both of those a little bit later. In addition to those, most states have universities or academic research centers that may focus on state budgeting or the state economy or finances. An example of this is the Rockefeller Institute at the State University of New York at Albany, but there are lots of these in universities that may focus on just the issues in an individual state. And then there are legislative audit and budget offices. These are significant because they're independent of the executive branch, and they are by and large nonpartisan organizations, although in some cases you have elected auditors. And these include things like the Office of Program Performance and Government Accountability in Florida, or OPAGA, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission in Virginia, and the Office of the Legislative Analyst in California. So these are just some of the sources that you could look to for information on state budgets. So I'll close there and we'll move on to the next presentation.
Thanks, Bill. Now we'll turn it over to Steve Fair with State Line.
Thank you. Today I would like to give you 3 tips. First, get to know your budget director. Second, read and use a document called a Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. Again, that's Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. And 3, read the documents that the state issues when it sells its bonds in the bond market. Now, this week we had a pension conference here in Washington, and one of the people who attended was John Nixon, and he's Michigan's budget director, and he's also an officer with this organization, the National Association of State Budget Officers, which has a very useful website and a very good resource for you on this. John was here. When he was here, I asked him, knowing that I was going to participate in this webinar, I said, John, what tip would you give reporters covering state budgets? And his answer was actually a variation of of my first tip. He said, get to know your budget director. He said, budget directors want you to get it right, so they'll take the time to explain it to you if you let them. He talked about having reporters in his office on the day that the governor issues his budget proposal to go over things that they might not have understood. I always, in my career as a reporter, looking back, one of the compliments I got was when I was covering the Washington, D.C. Transit Agency in the early 90s. And the budget director for Metro and the general manager invited me over to rehearse their budget presentation that they were going to give to the board of directors the next day. So they wanted to test it out on me to see what my reaction would be, because they thought my questions would be similar to what the board of directors were going to ask. So I got the budget a day in advance by doing that, because they wanted me to understand it, but they knew that I would take the time to get it right. If you come across a budget document and find it easy to navigate and easy to read, tell the budget director that. They'll love you for saying that. Remember that this is the document that they care about the most, that they work on throughout the year. They want your feedback. And if you give some feedback, they'll remember you and they'll try to help you. I always remember the time I told the county executive in Fairfax County, Virginia, in suburban Washington, that his budget book was one of the best I'd ever read. And the look on his face when I said that really surprised me. He was really flattered that I had taken the time to look through it, and that I gave him a compliment. And from that moment on, I could ask him anything about that budget, even if it was a tough question, because he took the time to patiently and completely answer me. He always remembered me saying that about his budget. Second, remember, you're not just covering a budget. It's not just the budget proposal that you should focus on. You're covering the state finances and the state's financial condition. And there are a few documents in addition to the budget that I found extremely helpful that you may not know about. One is this comprehensive annual financial report, and you'll hear people in government go by the acronym CAFR. They'll call it the CAFR. I found it to be a real treasure trove of information about your state's financial condition. There's usually, and on the screen we're looking at just the cover page of Virginia's, I just decided to use that. They're all pretty much the same. They all tend to have a financial section, which includes information about how state government is financed, how many funds the state has. This is where you go to find out information about the public pension system, in addition to documents the pension system will put out. But these are very reliable numbers that you can go to that kind of give you a snapshot of the state's financial condition. And what I found is that it has a lot of rich information that you can just drop into stories. In the Virginia one, for example, there's a sentence that says approximately 47.8% of the primary government total revenue came from taxes. So you have, and it breaks down the other 53%. It also had a sentence that said, while the primary government's expenses cover many services, the largest expenses are for education and individual and family services. So it gives you little nuggets that you can drop into stories. It talks about how much the state borrows, what debt it's been issuing, how much it's accumulated. But usually there's a section in these reports called the statistical section, and it's going to tell you things like the tax rates in the state, school enrollment, the unemployment rate by county often, the historical state unemployment rate, personal income year by year. It's going to tell you the top employers in the state. So even in your coverage, you can figure out, well, what are the what bills are going through the legislature that may be important to these top employers. It also, in Virginia's case, I found it interesting that the Fairfax County Public School System is the third top employer in Virginia. So if you're covering issues in your state capital, you'll want to make sure you pay attention to schools, and particularly that district. Walmart is a big employer in most states, so and it's the second largest in Virginia. So if there's something, an issue regarding a Walmart being built somewhere, you can drop in the sentence, well, Walmart is the second top employer in the state, and you'll get that from the CAFR. It'll tell you how many state employees you have. It'll tell you, it'll show you, well, higher education employees are declining, state police are declining. It'll tell you how many traffic tickets the state police write year by year. So you can look at it to note trends in that, to see whether the state police are, you know, maybe in times of recessions they're writing more tickets for revenue. So you can look at those trends during recessions. And finally, I mentioned to you that when the state sells bonds, they usually put out bond documents, and these go to people that are considering buying these bonds. You usually can find these documents on the internet, but your budget office, when they get ready, you know, ask them when they're getting ready to sell bonds for the prospectus or for the budget documents, or even go to a stockbroker, and they can also give them. And these documents will give you a lot of financial information, but it's written in a way as if you were from another planet, almost from another state, and you don't know anything about this state. And the one I have on the screen is just a sample from Illinois, and it tells you, it's going to tell you how the Illinois government is structured. It tells you what construction project the state has going on right now, how much it borrows, a little bit about its pension system, and its tax structure. And keep in mind when you read these documents that it's going to sort of put the best face on the state's finances, because they're trying to get people to buy these bonds. So for another look, and to conclude, remember that there are agencies, credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, that rate these bonds as they're going to sale, and they offer judgments about the state's finances. They'll be more critical. They'll say, we're concerned, for example, Illinois is borrowing too much. And often when they give their judgments about the bonds, in addition to analyzing the state's financial condition, they will have, they'll go right down, they'll even tell you the name of the person, the analyst at the agency that looks at this state, and you can call that person up at the agency, and since they're following what happens in that state capital, you'll get a good look at the financial condition of your state from kind of more of a critical point of view. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Now we'll hear from Pam Praw with State Line.
Thanks, Nicole. We've talked a lot about the numbers, what they mean, and where to find them. I'm going to give you a few tips so you can put a human face to a story that could otherwise be just a lot of numbers. I know most of you, or many of you, are at the State House, so you're probably close to a school, a state park, a nursing home, an unemployment office, and these are great places where you can find people who will be affected by the changing funding levels of any of those programs. Sometimes you can't do that, or you may want to reach outside the capital area. So I'm going to share a few experiences here at State Line that might give you some ideas. Recently, we did a story on food stamps. We wanted to see which states had the biggest increase. This information comes from the federal government every month. So when I did the story, it was Idaho. So I interviewed the director of the state welfare office, and the story turned into a budget story. He basically told me that at the same time that more people were coming to his office for food stamps, that his department had to lay off more than 100 people. They also weren't filling about 200 vacant positions. Because of the budget cuts, the department also had to close 9 of the department's 29 welfare offices. So that meant that food stamp caseworkers in Idaho saw their caseloads go from 200 to more than 600. The story had a lot of numbers, but I think these are the kind of numbers that shows the impact that readers could understand. For the same story, I also talked to some advocacy groups who then put me in touch with people who were getting food stamps. So I was able to get both the human impact from a state worker's point of view, as well as someone who was receiving the benefits, the folks who had to go to the offices and stand in line and fill out the paperwork. Obviously, the advocacy groups have a point of view. They will give names of people who may give you the group's position on a certain issue. But these folks will also tell you their personal story, what's happening in their lives, and I think that will help add color to your story. This gets me to the point, I'm guessing a lot of you also cover maybe rallies at the Capitol or big hearings where both sides of the issue are being presented. I have found in the past that I get better information if I get these people's phone numbers and then call them when they're back at their home or at their business, away from the Capitol. I tend to ask better questions if I don't have to shout over everybody else, and I tend to find that the folks open up a little bit better. They don't have a microphone stuck in their face. My second example is along the same lines. I recently did a story about governor's proposals to cut business taxes. So here I was thinking, well, how could I put a human face on this? Well, what I did is I tried to track down people who own their own business. I contacted both the local Chamber of Commerce and the local chapter of the National Federation of Independent Business for names of business owners, and I interviewed several of them. They weren't lobbyists. They didn't give me canned responses. So here too, I was able to add some color. Another suggestion I have is to talk to your legislators. Yes, they hear a lot from lobbyists, but they also hear from their constituents. They hear from families and business owners. Also look for letters to the editor in your own newspaper. My final example comes from my colleague Steve. He did a story when the stimulus that came out that showed that the cuts were, states were cutting funding for auditors. And the reason I bring this up is because the auditors are often overlooked. Steve found in his reporting that just as the states were being required to do more work, to track how they were spending the stimulus money, that these offices were being cut. So these are the same offices who are charged with finding waste, fraud, and abuse. So they might be working on projects that will be useful for your own reporting.
Thanks, Pam. And finally, we'll hear from Kilha, who will walk us through some of the trends in state finance that we're following and that may be candidates for stories in your state.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to walk through some of the fiscal trends we're watching here at the Pew Center on the States, trends we think that could serve as a foundation for some of the story ideas in your state. I'm going to discuss the challenges we see, the action states are taking, and some of the budget stories we're carefully watching. It's an understatement to say that states are facing a critical moment. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, the states faced a cumulative budget gap of more than $86 billion for fiscal year 2012, bringing the total cumulative gap figures to nearly $500 billion in the past 4 years. We've seen trends in 3 core areas. Revenues remain below pre-recession levels. Service demands continue to increase, and states are beginning to feel the long-term pressures that will factor into their budgets for years to come. First, let me look at revenues. There's been a lot of coverage of states recovering revenues in the recent months, and it's true that revenues have begun to turn around. Very good news for states. According to the Rockefeller Institute of Government, for instance, they've grown for 5 consecutive quarters, and we're up in the first quarter of this year 9% over the same quarter in 2010. And while revenues are on the rise, they remain far below where states were before the recession, and many states say it'll be another few years before they're back to where they were in 2007 prior to the recession and in 2008 where revenues peaked. This is important for a couple of reasons. First, the stimulus funding that states have used to close gaps in the few years is largely dried up. So the combination of continued lower revenues plus the loss of stimulus funding pose problems for balancing budgets in many states this year. But the revenue trend story is also important because not only are revenues down from their earlier peaks, states are unable to accurately forecast their revenue levels, particularly during downturns. What we found at Pew is during the last 3 recessions, the errors in revenue estimating have gotten larger and larger. The mistakes have both happened on the downside as well as on the upside, and this trend on the upside has favored states this year, many of which were pleasantly surprised when their revenues came in higher than expected and saved them from making some of the most drastic cuts. And this trend sounds good for states while they're bringing in more than they expect, but we've also seen, as I mentioned, the opposite in this recession too, which complicates budgeting. The second budgeting challenge we've watched this year is the continued increase in demand for services. Beyond slashing state revenues, the recession also significantly drove up the demand for public services. Unemployment and other social safety nets have expanded, and more than 7 million people have been added to the Medicaid rolls nationally. In 2010, Medicaid surpassed K-12 education as the single largest item in the state budgets, accounting for 22% of total spending, according to the National Association of State Budget Officers, recently issued in their fiscal survey. The stimulus, particularly the enhanced Medicaid match, helped states pay many of these bills, but the extra Medicaid funding ends July 1st, and few other stimulus dollars remain. Finally, in terms of challenges, we see that even as they deal with the current year budget gaps, states are beginning to feel the effects of long-term fiscal pressures. State policymakers are increasingly looking to the future and at the long-term liabilities that will continue to put pressures on their budget. These liabilities include pensions and other post-employment benefits, otherwise known as retiree health care, they've promised to their employees, and the debt they've incurred to fund critical government programs. In terms of debt, over the last year, there's been a lot of talk that the municipal markets will be the scene of the next debt crisis. Certainly, this conversation has highlighted the fiscal challenges that state and local governments are under, but our own research has led us to see this with a far more nuanced perspective. Borrowing is an important and powerful financial tool for state governments. State and local debt levels have increased substantially during the last decade, but they're still below their 30-year high, which took place in 1993. What states are worried about is the increasing level of borrowing that they're going to have to do to face nearly $2 trillion in infrastructure improvements in order for the U.S. to stay competitive, and the higher interest rate environment that might result from the state's own fiscal conditions. We'll be releasing a series of reports beginning later in this year, further unpacking that trend with 50 state data. Additionally, let me talk a little bit about public sector retirement benefits. As Steve mentioned, we had a conference this past week, bringing together experts from across the country to talk about this very important issue. We just released a report that found that in fiscal year 2009, states had a $1.26 trillion shortfall between the promises that they made to employees for pensions and retiree health care and the money that they set aside. This widening gap is up from $1 trillion in fiscal year 2008. And this is largely a reflection of the state's difficult time during the recession and the Wall Street collapse of in the fall of 2008. But the data show that states got here by shortchanging pension programs in both good times and in bad times. The good news is that state investments on their pension assets have increased 28% in the last 2 years, but they're nowhere near out of the woods yet. States are still going to continue to account for the losses as a result of the financial crisis for many, many more years to come. And while debt and pensions are long-term bills, they have the potential to compete with other service areas and programs critical to states' economic vitality. So it makes sense that states are starting to look at them very closely now. And in fact, over the last 3 years, we've seen 28 states make some form of changes to their pension systems by either increasing employee contributions or by decreasing benefits at some level, particularly targeting new employees. States are moving decisively this year to close the $86 billion in budget gaps they face. The magnitude of the cumulative budget gaps that they've encountered in the last few years simply left them with few painless cuts to make, and yet tax increases were largely off the table, particularly in the last year and this year. With at least 13 governors and more than 1,200 legislators taking pledges not to raise taxes. So what did we see in terms of action? I'm going to describe a few trends that we've watched, but I'd also like to direct you to our legislative review that ran on Stateline last week. 5 separate stories about actions legislatures took in recent months. First, state cuts. Well, for the most part, states dealt this year with the budget gaps by cutting spending, a trend that has continued for several years. According to NASBO, spending decreased around 10% in fiscal years 2009 and 10, marking the first consecutive year-over-year declines on record. It's tough to find a spending category that's been spared from cuts. Together, Medicaid and K-12 education account for 43% of state spending, So it would have been almost impossible to close the gaps while maintaining current funding in those areas. Cuts were even deeper to higher ed, which is less protected in many states than K-12 funding. States have less flexibility to cut from Medicaid, where reductions to the roles of eligibility are constrained by federal health reform. And I think this is an important point to focus on, because while you saw state Medicaid budgets overall stay relatively flat, states themselves actually had to contribute more toward Medicaid spending. So states increased their share of the overall Medicaid budget, even in these tough budget times. Many states moved to cut the rates, but instead what states did is they moved to cut the rates that they pay their doctors and hospitals, and others are expanding the use of Medicaid managed care. Florida, for example, which will ask the federal government for approval to move all of its Medicaid patients to managed care, and it estimates that the move could save the state as much as $1 billion. Of course, states have the option of raising taxes to help bridge their budget gaps. And in fiscal year 2010, 29 states raised more than $24 billion in taxes and fees, the largest amount on record, according to NASBO. Those figures dropped precipitously last year, an election year, and this year just a handful raised taxes. In fact, we saw tax cuts in a number of states, particularly targeting ways to sort of help revive the economy and get businesses to invest in their states again. Not all of these efforts succeeded, but let me give you one example. In Michigan, Governor Rick Snyder succeeded in eliminating the state's complicated business tax, which will be replaced by 6% flat corporate tax. Additionally, revenue to make up the difference will come not from reducing the personal income tax rate as scheduled. You can read more about all of those cuts, as well as that particular move to eliminate the business tax in Michigan on stateline.org. We've also watched as the fiscal relationships have begun to shift among the federal government, states, and localities. This year, many states cut aid to their local governments. It's a move that helps the states balance its budget, but it creates problems at the city, town, and county level. It's a trend worth watching because when it comes to localities, they're feeling the revenue pressures also from drops in their property tax receipts. At our panel, at our pension convening, Beth Keller, who runs the Center for State and Local Government Excellence, actually said, when states catch a cold, localities catch pneumonia. So it's definitely worth watching the trends at the local level. And as we look beyond this fiscal year, it does seem that state efforts to address this year's budget gaps may have raised some longer-term questions. For example, the constitutionality of some of the cuts are being questioned in a number of states. Already, Nevada's attempt to balance its budget by taking funds from local accounts was invalidated by the courts, leading the state to instead extend some of the temporary tax increases that they made in previous years to move forward and fill the gap. And the cuts to K-12 education seem destined to spawn a number of lawsuits as well over the funding formulas that the court set a decade ago or more. We're also watching the forthcoming rulings over the changes to cuts in retiree benefits in Colorado, Minnesota, and South Dakota. So in summary, states continue to struggle with the effects of the Great Recession, but the long-term challenges remain, and we'll be continuing to watch those trends very closely. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. And Nicole?
Thanks so much, Gil. To ask a question, you can simply type a question in the chat box on the right-hand corner of your screen. We will take as many questions as possible within the time that we have left. We do ask that you identify yourself and your news outlet with your question. Well, I'll ask Steve a question. Steve, I know you've been reporting on the pension issue, and I know states have taken some actions to address the problem. What are you seeing across the states?
Well, this year we saw, now it's up, I think up to 27 states that have enacted some sort of pension benefit cuts. It was about the same number last year, but over the last 3 years, about every state has dealt with this. Some have dealt with it, several times in different rounds. Significantly, for those of you listening to this, I would look up the New Jersey legislature action from yesterday. You'll be hearing a lot about this because It was an example of a bipartisan effort to cut pensions. They have a Republican governor, and it took the Democratic leaders in the legislature and the Republican governor working together to reach an agreement. It was pretty far-reaching, and it was one of the states that needed the most reform. We mentioned, Gil mentioned a few minutes ago, these 3 states that eliminated or froze their cost of living adjustment for retirees last year: Minnesota, South Dakota, and Colorado. And New Jersey did the same thing yesterday. All 3 of those states wound up being sued by retirees for that. It'll be interesting to see if the same thing happens in New Jersey. I'd looked that up because it was kind of significant action yesterday. But they're not the first state to do that. Vermont, Delaware, Hawaii were other states where there was a bipartisan effort to do the same thing. We have a lot on our website on this if you'd like to, and we're always here to answer questions about public pensions.
Thanks so much, Steve. I'm going to throw the next one over to Pam. The question is, what is the best way to localize the state budget coverage to what will most affect the citizens in a particular area?
That's a great question. I think what I would do is I would see what areas were, well, in this time it's usually cut, what areas were cut the most. Let's say education. Education is usually the last place that folks want to cut, but in the last 2 years, more than half the states have cut K through 12 education. I would go to your local school. I would call your school district. I remember a few years back I did a story, and I was looking right at this issue, the cuts in education, and I found a school, I believe it was in Oklahoma, where the teachers had to pitch in and clean up. Basically, they laid off a lot of the janitors, so the teachers were pitching in, cleaning up the schools. So if you could find concrete examples like that, I mean, people were also contributing pencils and papers and things like that. That can give a that could localize the budget cuts. Also, on things like health care or social services, I would check with some of your church groups and nonprofit groups, because it filters down to them. Your food banks, they may be seeing increased number of people coming by, but I would first look to see which areas of the budget are being cut, and then go from there.
If I could add something to that, I think another area is higher education. The thing that makes higher education so interesting is that what you may see is a sort of substitution effect, which is that the state may be cutting back the funds that it's providing, and it may lead to increases in tuition. So the effect may be tuition and fees get raised, and so there's more of the burden that gets shifted to the students and the families when higher education is cut, and clearly you should be able to get people to talk about that.
Right. And today on the homepage of State Line today, you'll see a story that Florida's universities, the tuition was increased 15%, and that's on top of increases from the last few years as well. It's a great idea.
The next question is, we are dealing with natural disasters in the state, particularly flooding along the Missouri River. This is from Lee Enterprises in Des Moines, Iowa. What documents do you think we should be looking for as a state and the Fed start paying for mitigation, cleanup, and associated costs?
It's obviously going to have a budget impact. I'm trying to think about. I would have an emergency management agency, and they'd be working with somebody in the governor's office and the budget office on that. I can't point to any specific documents, but they'll certainly do a report when it's over. As far as the economic effects, maybe your economic development agency could help you with that.
I'm also pretty sure that when states ask the federal government to help,
right,
they do have to provide a lot of documents.
Yeah.
That would provide some background information.
Right.
So I would contact the governor's
Probably
office.
a lot of documentation, so there's, and it's all public, so
Right.
ask them for whatever they submitted to the federal government. But the other question, though, there was one about how to localize. No.
Yes.
Huh?
Okay.
That was one.
I think there's also a broader issue in that this sort of raises the federal contribution to state disasters, which is that you all may have heard that the federal government has a large budget deficit, and that as the federal government gets serious about dealing with its budget deficit, will suspend disbelief for a second and say that it's going to do that, then that's not necessarily a good thing for states and for local governments. That to the extent that states and local governments still find themselves in difficulties either of an emergency nature or an ongoing nature, I think it's going to be less and less likely that the federal government is going to step in and be able to make up any kind of shortfall or difference, which is then going to put the pressure directly on the states. And frankly, I think it's a particularly difficult problem for local governments, because I think that these fiscal difficulties will just eventually trickle down to local governments, because the feds will not provide the states money, and then the states will turn around and cut assistance to local governments, and local governments will be in the position of having to provide services with fewer resources.
Yeah, you know, that's a really good question. It might be a topic that we address at Capitol Beat, which is this association of government reporters that we have a connection with. They have a conference every year. It might be a topic because there have been so many natural disasters this year. It'd be really worthwhile to take a look at that.
And one thing to think about is, in the absence of federal aid moving forward because of the budget challenges that we have at the national level, and we've seen this before in past experience, where when federal aid to state diminishes, you see borrowing levels increase at the state level. And so to the extent that they are rebuilding after the natural disasters, you might see an uptick in borrowing. And you know, that's the trend that we're obviously closely watching. I mean, you know, borrowing, outstanding debt, at least net tax-supported outstanding debt at the state level, has grown over the last decade. And, you know, right now some estimates have us at you know, needing nearly $2 trillion in additional investment in infrastructure in order to stay competitive globally. With the natural disasters, you know, how much does that add to the overall borrowing needs, borrowing that we're going to need to do at the state level? I mean, that's just something that we should watch.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And so that's a question you could ask now: is this going to lead to more borrowing for the state? And that's where it helps to come in to have read the comprehensive annual financial report, and just have somebody, you know, give you a good briefing on where the state is with borrowing, if they're maxed out or if they still have room to borrow, because it might be relevant when they're trying to rebuild after a natural disaster.
Our next question is from Adam Russell from the Tyler Morning Telegraph. You mentioned that states were still below the 30-year high for debt. What was the sense of concern at that time? Can you give some perspective? I believe you said the high was 2003, and I understand the economy was ascending, but historically, where are the states now?
Well, I mean, debt levels have certainly grown, and that's the analysis that we'll be coming out with very shortly. And so I don't want to scoop myself just yet, but the 30-year high was 1993, and we have looked into why debt levels were at a historic high, or at least a 30-year high. 30-year high, rather, at that period, but unfortunately, we haven't really just sort of, we're not able to answer that question right now. We're still looking into it. A number of factors could potentially explain that, but right now we just don't have the answer.
If any of you are working on stories about borrowing or are curious about it, that's one of our specialties here, and we'd be happy to help you. So just give us a call. Some states borrow more than others. Your state, we can give you kind of a picture of it, but we can also tell you where to go to find out the documentation for that. We can help you navigate that a little bit. So feel free when this webinar is over, if you're doing that in the future, to give us a call.
I would just add that there's a direct relationship between the condition of infrastructure and the demand for borrowing. And so one of the things to pay attention to is, are there things that the state is responsible for that are just all going to wear out at once? And that can be roads, that can be bridges, that can be university dormitories or other buildings. It's not just necessarily that the state is providing more services, it's that they need to replace things and repair things in order to continue to provide the services they're already providing.
And Phil brings up an interesting point. I mean, traditionally states will finance for new projects or replacement or brand new infrastructure, but in terms of repairing and maintenance, I mean, it seems like, you know, that might be an area where you see increased borrowing, although that's difficult to say. I mean, it seems like that's an area that states have long sort of deferred what they needed to do, and so that bill will grow larger if left unattended.
So we don't have any more questions. Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar today. You can see here the contact information for our communications team, so please don't hesitate to call or email me or Liz if we can be helpful to your reporting, or if you're interested in learning more about our work. If you're interested in subscribing to Stateline, please visit us at stateline.org. Thanks again for attending the webinar today, and have a good weekend.